Okay, I hear the end of the music. I think that is my cue to start. My name is John Harris. I'm a new board member on the Miller Center. I'm also a career journalist. I'm one of the founders of Politico in Washington, D.C. Before that, I was a reporter at the Washington Post. That's relevant in the context of this discussion today because I spent the first 10 years of my career as a local reporter. And I think that the topic that we're tackling today is the future of local news and what that future is and how it's going to surmount very serious problems is one very close to my heart. I want to welcome our two co-authors, Jennifer Lawless and Danny Hayes, and congratulate them on a really important book on a really important subject, which is the future of local news. And, as moderator today, I play by Supreme Court rules. I don't think we want to just keep questions all to one end. I think when people have them, they should use the functionality that's on our webinar to send those questions in, and we'll try to intersperse them throughout the conversation, make this conversation as spontaneous and as informative as possible. Sometimes people like to just keep everything to the end. I don't think that's a way to have as stimulating a conversation as possible. So Jennifer, Danny, I was the book was, I have to say, mostly depressing for somebody like me. There were glimmers in there. Okay, maybe there's a little bit of optimism. I must say I read it as almost a sort of forced enterprise, mostly bad news, but we're really going to push ourselves to be to have some optimistic notes. I first would like to give you both an opportunity for the audience, many of whom haven't read the book yet, to summarize your basic arguments. And you can disagree with my characterization if you like, but I took away a book that highlights the problems of local news are not just the problems of journalists who happen to work for news organizations, or the problems of a larger society, because there's a direct relationship between citizen engagement and the larger democratic problem of holding public officials accountable, direct relationship between that and the quality, and in most places now, diminishing quality of local news. And only just a couple glimmers of optimism that we've yet figured this problem out. First off, tell us in your own words what you think the main takeaway of the book is, and you can critique my critique if you feel it's misplaced.
Well, I'll start, and then Jen can jump in and correct me where I get things wrong.
There will be many places.
John, thank you very much for moderating this conversation. We really appreciate it. And I think, we're in agreement that this is a gloomy book. This is a book that describes the challenges facing the local newspaper business over the last 20 years, as most people who are on the call, on the webinar probably know. And as you well know, local newspapers have been in deep financial distress for at least the last 10 years and going back at least 20 years. And we track in the book the decline of coverage of local government in more than 200 newspapers across the country. That obviously, as you noted, raises some questions about who's going to hold local officials and local government accountable in an era where the local news environment is significantly diminished and citizens have access to a lot less reporting about their local governments than they did even in the early 2000s. So by our measure, about 50% less coverage of local government that Americans have today than they did at that time. But it's not just about accountability. We also show in the book that the decline in coverage of local government has led to less citizen participation and engagement in local politics. For example, in 1966, about 70% of Americans knew the name of the mayor of their city or town, but today that number is just about 40%. 32% could name their school superintendent, but that number is now just about 15%. And so as political knowledge of local government has declined, we show in the book that that's a product in part of declining local news coverage. And so, for among the many reasons that it's a sort of a gloomy assessment is that there have not been really any widespread successful efforts to kind of fill the void left by these really important sources of civic engagement as the local newspaper business has gone away. And so obviously there's a lot of energy right now directed to trying to figure out ways to boost the local news business. And we think that that's obviously a critical part of American democracy today.
And one thing that I would add, that's another major take-home point of the book, is that this crisis, this demise in local news, is affecting everybody. So unlike national news, where if you're a political junkie, you can get it pretty much anywhere. You can plug a CNN IV into your arm and you can never stop getting information about national politics. If you're into local news, there aren't that many alternative outlets for you. And what that means is that as the amount of coverage declines when we're talking about city hall or school boards or county government, that means that regardless of whether you are politically interested or not at all interested, it's difficult to find out what's going on in your community. And we find that local TV has not overcome this gap. It's not like they're covering more local news because the local newspaper is doing less. And internet startups in some communities have been very, very successful, but they're certainly not enough to compensate for the overall loss of local journalism. And moreover, they're concentrated in a handful of states, usually in urban areas. And so basically for the national level, if you're information seeking, the information rich get richer and the information poor can just check out altogether. At the local level, everybody's getting poorer.
Yeah. So Jennifer, I'd like to ask you a question that I've pondered. There are examples of media sort of meeting and actually prospering in the challenges presented by the digital revolution and the erosion and in many cases the eradication of the old business models that sustained so-called legacy media. The publication I work for is one. In the fields of sports, entertainment, there have been successful innovations and a number of successful innovations in national politics. Not many successful innovations in certain fields that leave us really worried. Local news is one, foreign news is another. What's the difference between the haves and the have-nots in this? Why is it success in some areas but not others?
Some of it just has to do with content. And the reality is that at the national level, there are a greater number of people who warrant sort of steady attention, who are doing, whether we think they're interesting or salacious or whatever things. A lot of what's going on in Congress, a lot of what's going on in the White House is just objectively more interesting to a lot of people than what's happening at the school board. Now, there's potential for that to be changing as we've seen a devolution of power to the local level. And certainly during the pandemic, as we've seen local school boards, local city councils making more and more decisions about mask mandates, about in-person schooling, various components. But generally speaking, most Americans aren't that interested in foreign affairs. Most Americans aren't that interested in local government until we prime them and make them think about the importance of local government. So the optimistic piece of this book is that when we remind people that local government does important things and is an important part of their life, they're open to the idea of consuming it. But that's not the top of the head consideration for a lot of people. Where about Congress or the White House or federal politics, there's this general sense that it's interesting or entertaining or important.
Yeah, I want to return to that later. There's experiments that you highlight near my area. I live in Alexandria, but in Arlington, Virginia, which is where Politico's headquarters is, incidentally. And I think the other example I remember was from the Charlottesville area. So we can return to that in a moment. But one question that I was genuinely curious for both of you in reading the book is the question of culpability. Sometimes the story of the decline of local news is about rapacious owners who don't have a clear sense of the public interest, hedge funds who come in and their math only works if they can really lower costs. But it seems to me also maybe the bigger problem is tectonic shifts in the way people consume information, the way they think of themselves as citizens, and that it's not just a problem of enlightened ownership. It's the fact that readers haven't followed this major technological shift, major economic shift in the industry. So it's not simply a problem of white hats versus black hats, but address that. How much should be laid at the feet of just people who are not enlightened media owners?
Well, in the book, I think a core part of our argument is that it's both. So as Jen was describing, there's an audience problem, and local news has an audience problem, and you can see this in traffic to local news websites and people's tendency to gravitate toward national news. And there's a variety of explanations for that. But there is also a supply side explanation, not just demand. That is, local publishers of local newspapers have made decisions over the last 2 decades about what kinds of content to prioritize and what kinds of content to let fall away and devote less attention to. In the book, we don't spend a lot of time talking about variation among ownership structure, but what I'd say is that although the influence of hedge funds like Alden Capital and others on papers like the Denver Post quite prominently and others is no doubt significant. And I think there is a growing body of research in social science that suggests that those kinds of corporations cut their newspapers and devote less attention to local politics than other papers. At the same time, I think it's important to emphasize that we studied 200 local newspapers across the country over the course of 15 years. And the variation in the patterns that we found is actually pretty small. Every paper in our data set cut local coverage of local government by upwards of 50%. Some cut it more. Almost all the papers cut things like county commission coverage or school board coverage more than they cut coverage of mayors and city councils. One reason is because the economic incentives to do so are much greater. So regardless of the ownership structure, there's a lot of commonality in the trajectory, the downward trajectory of coverage of local news. And that just has to do with the fundamental change, as you mentioned, to the revenue models that newspapers traditionally operated under. So our view is that the corporate ownership and interests of news organization that publishers have in making money certainly contributes to it, but we don't have a lot of evidence in the book that is this key source of the problem. The key source of the problem is just a complete disruption of the business model, and publishers had to make decisions of what to keep and what to cut, and they cut local government coverage.
Yeah, Jennifer, maybe you want to follow up on that, but we have an audience question that I think is germane to this. It's from John Smith, asking if you saw the recent Atlantic magazine cover story, "Who Killed America's Newspapers?" That piece, if I'm remembering correctly, really did put the emphasis on rapacious owners and people not acting in the public interest. Did you see that piece, and how does that intersect with the arguments of your book?
I did. I'm sure I did too. I mean, we're not saying that rapacious owners are, should be let off the hook. It's just that, and it's possible also there are examples of philanthropic families who have decided they are going to invest in local news, and that can be enough to save a paper. But when we're talking systematically about how to ensure that the average consumer, regardless of where he or she lives, has access to information about local politics and what's going on in the political institutions at the local level, we have to think more broadly about the economics and the technology and not only the ownership structure. So, I think that something that we try to do in the book is demonstrate that this problem didn't come out of just one, there's not just one component of the problem, it's a multi-pronged problem. And if we're going to solve it, we're going to need a multi-pronged solution. There are supply and demand problems that got us here, and there are going to have to be supply and demand solutions that get us out. Yeah,
and I was especially interested in demand. We referenced it obliquely a moment ago, but it seems to me that if the issue is like, look, you need to eat your spinach if you're going to be a responsible citizen. You need to be aware of what's going on. It just isn't likely to work long term to scold people and say, eat it. I know you don't like it, but eat it. You have to figure out a way to make that spinach more appealing. What are the ways of making that that spinach tastes like something you don't want to skip it and go right to dessert? You want to eat it. The research you mentioned in Charlottesville and Arlington, maybe in other places, what does that tell us about creating the demand that can sustain robust local news coverage?
Well, one of the things that is important to keep in mind is that the reason that local newspapers for so long were able to devote a lot of resources to covering local government is because that they had other content that was subsidizing that coverage. So people read their newspaper for sports scores, for movie listings, for recipes, for coupons, et cetera. And all of that, what we might think of collectively as kind of entertainment content, is probably what allowed local newspapers to devote the kind of attention to city councils and county commissions and school boards that have sort of helped spur civic engagement at the local level over the course of most of the 20th century. But once the internet sort of essentially makes that bundled product no longer a viable economic product, the problem now is, how, as you note, how do you get people to pay attention to the local government coverage that they don't get on their way to ESPN.com or on their way to Politico to get their national news coverage? So I think there's a couple things that we suggest. So one is that in these experiments that we conducted we did them both in survey experiments with nationally representative samples. We also did them in exit polls in Arlington in 2018 and in Charlottesville in 2019. And what we found is that when you remind citizens that local government does a lot of things that are important, that is, that it affects their lives in substantial ways, and you remind them that there's a social norm that if you're a good citizen, you're supposed to keep up with what's going on in your local government, that when we remind people about those things, they become more likely to engage with local news, either by signing up for a local news digest from a local news provider, or by indicating greater interest in news stories that are related to local politics. So although one of the arguments by journalists often about how we get consumers to pay attention to the local news crisis is to tell them that things are going to be bad if local news organizations go away, our view is that requires like a sort of a hypothetical way of thinking about things that isn't very easy for consumers. And so a different way to think about it is sort of a bank shot. Get Americans thinking about the importance of local government. Local news organizations are the institutions that cover local government, and that will bring the audience back to local news to some extent.
Right. And so basically, it's not that they have to eat their spinach, it's that they have to realize this isn't spinach.
Yeah. And as you imagine that this problem, one hopes, getting solved, do you see the more promising avenue in sort of established news organizations get smarter about how to invest in compelling news coverage and present it to the audience in ways that, as you say, Jen, people don't regard it as spinach. They regard it as something important. They're glad to pay for it. Sure, sign me up. Or do you think that causes is lost or mostly lost in most places? And to the extent that there's a good remedy, it's going to come from places like you mentioned in the book, Arl Now for Arlington County. It's going to rest in different types of experiments of people, that, in other words, enterprises that didn't even exist a few years ago, or maybe don't exist yet, that are going to solve this problem. Did you regard one avenue or the other as more promising?
I mean, I think that the digital avenue and the internet avenue has potential. I just think that potential hasn't been realized over the course of the last 15 years, which leads me to believe, and I think which leads us to believe, that there have got to be ways to reinvigorate interest in national and local news through legacy newspapers, and trying to figure out how to have them acquire the resources required to present the kind of news that consumers are accustomed to. I mean, part of the issue here is that it's a vicious cycle, because as resources are being cut, what these papers can cover is less and less, which means that people see less and less value in the paper, which means resources are cut, and so it goes. We had one journalist tell us that for a while he was actually getting a free Wall Street Journal because the paper itself was so thin and the local news was so anemic that in order to get it over the fence, the delivery person had to actually add weight to the package. Right? Yeah. That's the kind of strategy that
we've seen that.
Oh, let me go sign up for local news.
I remember reading as a kid, visiting grandparents, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and by the time it died, nobody really would care anymore, right? It wasn't anything that compelling. It was just such a shadow of its former self. Let me look in the chat here. I think we've got another Okay, I think this is from Steve Kuhn in our audience. He's got 3 questions there related. At least I think they are. We're going to make them so. He asks, the increased partisan press seems to return to the highly partisan press during colonial times, and I'd add well after that, really into the 19th and early 20th century, when the elite-owned newspapers used them to promote their ideological views and political aspirations. Do you see us living a repetition of that? Let's tackle that, and then we'll get to the other 3. Do you? I suppose that the question could apply broadly, not just to local news, but tackle it however you wish.
Well, that's certainly the era that we're in now when it comes to national politics, is that there's just a lot of options for people who want news from various ideological or partisan points of view, and they can go find it. And so we now have a media environment that in some ways replicates what we had after the founding of the country. In other ways, obviously, because technology is very different, it's fundamentally different. And the aims of those news outlets are somewhat different, especially economically. But at the local level, I think it's certainly a possibility that the future of local news looks something like a partisan press. In one sense, that's not great. Normatively, I think the judgment of most observers is that there's a lot of value in having largely nonpartisan news organizations at the local level who follow the kind of professional norms that have dominated journalism for the last 70 or 80 years in the United States, whose job is not to cheerlead for some side or the other, but to try to give people the best kind of reporting about what's going on in their community that they can. On the other hand, the partisanship of the country is a reality. And one thing that is likely to bring people back to local government is partisan conflict. And to the extent that trust in traditional local news organizations at the local level continues to decline, it's obviously higher now than for the national media. But to the extent that it continues to decline, that will open up a market for more partisan content in places where there's an audience for it. So I think that's certainly a possibility that like observers in the United States should be prepared for.
Yeah, and Jen, Steve's other 2 parts really they resonate with me in my Politico experience, which is the decline of local news seems to be related in part to the migration of advertising revenue to online publications, no question. So what are the implications of that? And is there a space for entrepreneurs in local markets to move into these news deserts by focusing on a narrow niche? I would say this resonates with me because sort of the essence of what I believe about media in any context. And certainly it helped inform what we did at Politico, is that you have to move away from commodity news. In other words, you should be producing content that can somehow command a premium from the audience, that it's not just whatever kind of spare cents you can get through run of site advertising, or clickbait news. You can command that premium either through creating content that advertisers really want to be against because the audience is so attractive, or you can command the premium by making people pay. This is valuable, and you should gladly pay. And in general, the narrower you are, the more, in my experience, the more you can get people to pay. But that's a national experience. Maybe doesn't hold locally. I'm curious what you think, Jennifer.
Well, one of the things that we did for the book was interview several dozen local journalists and publishers and editors of these at various points across the country. And some of them have taken that route. They've decided that they have to be entrepreneurial. They have to focus just on the investigative stories, or they have to focus just on how national stories are affecting what's happening in their town, like at the border, for example, in a southern state. Most papers did not take that approach. And instead, they're just trying to still be almost everything to everybody, but with fewer resources. I think the jury's out on which approach is the best way to go, because none of these papers is thriving when it comes to local journalism, but some feel like, well, by narrowing the scope, they're creating a good that people will be willing to pay for. The additional challenge is that as the baby boomers get older and older and older, they are going to become a decreasing share of newspaper readers. And younger people, we found this out not only, we know this not only from polls, but also from some of the young journalists themselves that we interviewed, don't want to pay for news, right? They have a different view of the world and what's worth paying for and what you should be able to get online for free. And so part of the approach that we're recommending, where we sort of try and invigorate this demand, the appeal is that it seems to have worked just as well for young potential newspaper readers as older ones. And we've got to figure out how to inject them into the system. So, I think there are different models out there that could potentially work. But the reality is that whether you're talking about some sort of niche journalism, or you're talking about investigative reporting, or you're still talking about being all things to all people, no one has the resources to do it to the extent that they want to do it right now.
Yeah. So a couple of related questions. Barbara Brody invokes the notion of alternate facts, which of course we've seen so much. Alternate facts is another way of, in my view, of saying non-facts, or things that are false and often knowingly false, but used to manipulate the audience. We've seen lots of examples of that in national politics. Do we see that playing out in the local context? And then I think somewhat related question from John Bristow, who wonders whether a root cause of this decline might be weaker civics education among young people. So whether we're not developing the habits of civic engagement at the local level, you're really starting at the schools.
I think it's a plausible hypothesis. I think that I'm not aware of any research that's actually been able to plausibly kind of put that argument to a test. But again, there's a circularity here, which is that one reason that civics may seem less relevant at the local level now or in schools is that everything about politics in the United States seems to center around national politics. And part of that has to do with changes to the media environment. Part of that has to do with the increased partisan polarization, which is many ways makes politics something that is hard to turn away from at the national level. And so I think, civics education may be a part of the story, but the story is really probably more about the external changes to politics in the United States that have drawn Americans' attention away from local politics and toward national politics. And the decline of local newspapers is both a cause and a symptom of it. The argument we make in the book is that part of the reason for the decline in civic engagement in local politics is indeed about the departure of the audience from local news organizations. There are fewer people who are getting their news from these local sources and hearing about local government, so they're less likely to participate in local elections or know who their local officials are. But there's an additional contribution to that decline that's made by the decline of coverage itself. And so I think our view is that civics education may be part of the solution, but it certainly isn't going to solve the entirety of the problem.
Yeah. Wondering if you could both explain a little bit about how you found this subject intellectually and how you came to be collaborators together on this. You give me the story behind the story about this book.
You're a former journalist. You want to start?
The Jen will tell the story about how this project emerged from some other research that we had done, which started when we were both faculty members at American University in DC. But my interest in the topic comes from the fact that I was a newspaper reporter in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a little Scripps Howard paper called the San Angelo Standard Times in West Texas. And when I was there, I worked on a city desk that I think had about 10 reporters and a city editor, covering a circulation area that was the size of Illinois, going all the way out into El Paso. Now, there's only about 15 people that actually live in that entire area, but it was a large area to cover. I looked the other day, and that newsroom is now down to 3 reporters covering that exact same circulation area, covering all the same cities and towns that I and my other fellow reporters were expected to cover at the time. And so, part of our interest in this came from wondering about what is the effect of that on citizens and on civic engagement? And the book shows pretty persuasively that the experience that my old newsroom had has been replicated across the country, and it has had deleterious consequences for engagement at the local level.
And the project grew out of another book that we had written. We had investigated gender differences in media coverage of congressional campaigns in midterm elections. We had looked at 2010 and 2014. I was particularly interested in that because I had run for Congress in 2006, and my relationship with the local paper and media coverage there was great and was a key component of being able to do okay in the race, although I lost. But anyway, one of the things that happened as we were investigating media coverage, which, by the way, for people who care, there were no gender differences, was that we were struck by the fact that there was very little coverage overall. So on average, in the 30 days leading up to the midterm elections, the largest circulating newspaper in each congressional district ran about 15 stories. So a story roughly every other day in 2010. By 2014, which granted was a less competitive cycle, we were down to about one story every 3 days. And so the fact that local newspapers were still the main source of information for people that were following congressional candidates, and that coverage was declining so precipitously in just a short period of time, we figured, you know what, it's important to look more broadly. Congressional races are going to be getting more coverage than a lot of these other local positions. And, you know, going back in time, we could really track sort of from its heyday what local news came to look like. So it was a project that became this project. And basically we've been writing a book together for like 11 years.
So before we figure out the economic model of newspapers, I've been thinking about your own economic model, which is if the two of you were to start a consulting business and you would go to local papers and they would pay you to help them figure out these challenges of Duluth, Minnesota, or El Paso, or the Daily Progress in Charlottesville. What would be your advice as consultants? Like, look, here's how we've studied this. Here's what you need to do to engage an audience.
Well, the first piece of advice is probably not to waste your money on a couple of egghead academics.
No.
To tell you much about your business, but
you're supposed to sell them on the premium package.
We went into academics because we're not good business people. So I think, and I don't think that either of us would presume to have a better handle on the economic challenges that news organizations are facing than the people who are currently running them and trying to dig out are. So, but I think that this maybe is an opportunity to return to arlingtonnow.com, which you mentioned, and that is related to some of the work that we did in the book. And note that I think that one of the reasons that Arlington Now is a local news website that covers Arlington County, just outside of DC, and it's been successful. It's profitable. And it has been around for more than 10 years now. And it does a pretty good job, actually, of covering Arlington County government and a number of other things in the community. And I think its success is instructive in two ways. One is that it's a bundled product. That is, if you go on arlingtonnow.com, one of the things you can learn about is which restaurants are opening and which ones are closing. You can learn about real estate listings in the area. You can learn about activities for kids on the weekend. You can also get coverage of what the Arlington County government is doing as you scroll down the page. It's a way of providing news, hard news, local news about local government to citizens, as many of them are coming there to get the information about the restaurant closings and openings. And so in that sense, that's one way for news organizations, I think, to try to replicate the bundle of the old days of the newspaper, is to create their sites in ways so that people who come for the non-public affairs content can get exposure to the public affairs content by virtue of the other stuff. But the second thing that's instructive is maybe a sort of a little less optimistic, is that one reason that Arlington Now has been successful is because it's in one of the wealthiest, most educated, most politically interested counties in the country. And the challenge for local news startups and even the local newspapers that are trying to survive is that unless they are in a market with a significant advertising, an attractive advertising consumer audience, that it's difficult to attract a large enough audience that advertisers will pay for when you can go to Facebook and Google and other places. And so this is one of the reasons that most of the successful startups that this new wave of news organizations have been in big urban centers and not in the many communities across the country that are losing their newspapers or have lost a significant amount of local coverage.
I might add that even I, as a pretty voracious news consumer, I don't really gravitate to news as it's presented, the kind that I used to do when I worked for the Metro section of the Washington Post. That is, trying to cover a metropolitan area. I just don't think that way. I don't think of myself as a citizen of the Washington metropolitan area. I think of myself as a citizen of Alexandria, and maybe even particularly my area of Alexandria. And it's hard to get me hooked on a news that seems abstract at the local level. Pretty easy to get me hooked on what is going on with there's this proposal, everybody's up in arms about bike lanes. I think they're good, but you can tell all the signs on the road, people are really mad about the bike lines because they've made traffic worse. But that sort of tactile news is hard to cover because you can't be in 1,000 different neighborhoods.
So part of this problem is something that the journalists themselves told us about. It's part of the reason that county government coverage has taken such a hit, because when you have fewer resources and you want to cover something that will be of interest, you want to cover what's going on where the bulk of your readers are, which means that people who were in the outskirts of that county or in the outskirts of a district are not going to get the kind of coverage about what's going on in their neighborhoods and in their local communities, because there are fewer resources. There are fewer reporters who go to lots of meetings. So they're going to go to the meetings where there are more residents. And so what this means then is that when you're able to maintain some degree of coverage, or when you're able to start a local startup, it's going to be in the communities that probably already have some degree of coverage to begin with. Now, the upside to that is that there are at least going to be some places around the country where you might be able to get a decent supply and a steady diet of local news, but it also is potentially a recipe for more haves versus have-nots.
John, the bike lane example is a pretty interesting one, and I'm going to suggest something that Jen and I don't have any evidence for, and so she can shout me down if I'm getting out over my skis on this. But there's a lot of social science research that suggests that people's social identities and their attachments to their group, whether that's race, gender, ethnicity, whatever the group, social group, we think people think of themselves as, and bike riders versus drivers is one way to think about society. And there's a lot of evidence in social science that people are drawn to stories, politics that involves group conflict, because it's easy to identify us versus them. It's easy to identify who's right and who's wrong, which side am I on? And that's one thing that national news has a lot of. I mean, you know this at Politico, you know this from being a news consumer yourself, is that this is a part of the dynamic of national news coverage today. It's Democrats versus Republicans. And as many people think about it, that means it's good versus evil. But at the local level, that kind of coverage is more rare. It's partly because at the local level, conflicts are sometimes less, they're not partisan, either because local officials don't have formal partisan affiliations, so they're not elected as Democrats or Republicans. But it's also that local news coverage, I think, less frequently frames debates in local politics in these terms. And so one thing that might increase Americans' engagement with local news and help the local news business and also help engage people in local politics is to the extent that people think more about local politics as conflicts among groups. Now, the downside to that, of course, is that you raise the prospect of more social conflict, which is not, as we know, is not always a good thing. But it does mean that sometimes there's a trade-off between, like engaging people in politics and the kind of sober discourse that, the classically democratic citizen that we imagine is supposed to engage in. And I think that one of the pieces of evidence that we do have in the book, that thinking about local news as it connects to people's social context, is that in our experiments, when we sort of shame people into paying attention to local news by reminding them, hey, you're supposed to do this if you're a good citizen, they respond. And that suggests that social context is something that is important even at the local level, where it sometimes seems like it's less relevant.
Yeah, the editor in me says if it's as important as you say, then there's got to be a way to make it interesting. It's our responsibility as journalists to connect that to what the audience think. We've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to let one of these questioners budge the line because it's Bill Antholis and he's in charge. But he also has a question that I've been curious about, Jennifer, which is, could you name some of the, a couple examples which you think have been the most successful local papers in the United States? Are they in big cities, smaller cities? What are the success stories out there? What can we learn from them?
I mean, I think Danny's better situated to answer this question. I will say that in general, and I did lots of interviews with the journalists. I didn't do sort of case studies of the papers themselves, but what I will say is that the recipe that sort of seemed to continue to come up among these journalists was having the flexibility to actually cover what they wanted to cover that they knew would be important to the community. And too often they were having fewer and fewer hours and fewer minutes within those hours to spend time on the story that they wanted, because they were also laying out the obituary page, or they were also the one programming the op-ed to go online. And so, you know, the papers that have been somewhat successful have been able to maintain a degree of reporting and a newsroom size where they haven't tried to be everything to everybody.
One example that we talk about in the book is the Toledo Blade in Ohio. And the Toledo Blade looks a lot like many other newspapers in our study, where it's cut its coverage of local government significantly over the last 20 years. But compared to the declines in most of the other papers that we looked at, it's declined less. So that's what constitutes a happy story in our book, is that the curve in terms of the decline of local coverage is just less steep. In talking to the editor at the Blade, you know, one of his explanations, connecting to something we talked about earlier, was that, you know, they're owned by the Block family. They're not owned by a corporation. It's a family-owned newspaper that where the editorial team feels like they can invest in local journalism because the owners actually care about it. So that speaks.
By the way, Rick Willis asked a question that's relevant to what you just said. Is there evidence that local sort of in-community owners are better than absentee owners or corporations from outside?
So anecdotally, yes. But again, quantitatively, if we try to look at the papers and the changes, the differences are not that large, is because, as I mentioned, the what we found was like highly uniform across all different kinds of papers, a different size. There are some small variations, with smaller papers seeming to cut local coverage more than bigger papers, which is mostly a story about resources. And those are the papers that are actually more likely to be owned by community owners. I mean, the analogy that I think about is that if you build two sandcastles on the beach and you fortify one pretty well, and the other one you don't spend that much time fortifying it, the fortified one is like a newspaper that's owned by an independent owner. And so maybe it's going to stand up better to the wave. But when the wave comes, it's going to knock them both down. And so you can do a lot, but when the revenue model for the newspaper business is completely blown up, it's hard for even the most community-minded, conscientious owners to save the paper from what we observe with almost every paper across the country.
And what about public policy remedies? Are there actions that should be taken by Congress? Are there incentives that might exist in the tax code, or should there be levers that the social media and search companies are forced to return money for local coverage, to the extent this intersects with specific public policy remedies? What are some of the ideas out there?
Well, so before we even get to the ideas, let me just highlight another gloom and doom story, which is it won't happen, right? I mean, Democrats and Republicans both drive on roads and go over bridges, and we can't figure out a way to fund those. So given the partisan media environment, it's very unlikely that you're going to get Democrats and Republicans to come together to provide any sort of incentive for the dissemination of news, where you've now got a country at the national level anyway, who believe two completely different sets of information. So I think that we're in such a heightened partisan environment, and that environment is so is so much exacerbated by the news media and people's perceptions of the news media that this is a very, very tricky and trying time to think about, sort of any federal legislation or national public policy. At the local level, there might be a few more opportunities and incentives, but I don't think that this is going to be one of these things that can be solved with a big change to the tax code.
Another question here comes from Matthew Paxton. He says he finished the book last night, and his observation is that there are more weekly newspapers than dailies that seem to be doing a good job of covering local news and government, and whether you have any take on that, whether a weekly model rather than a daily model might be more sustainable.
That may be true, maybe partly true just because of numbers, because there are a lot more weekly newspapers in the United States than there are daily ones. Although, the newspaper closures across the country, which has gotten a lot of attention in the last 10 years, are almost exclusively weekly newspapers. So those are outlets that have really been hit hard by changes to the economic situation. There are obviously good weekly newspapers that cover their communities and can do so somewhat effectively. We don't study them in our book because we're looking at daily newspapers, but I certainly think that there are places where those kinds of news outlets can thrive. Again, they're most likely to thrive in places that have an already fairly wealthy, well-educated population, so that those news organizations can build an advertising base in the local community. Without that attractive audience, it's difficult for even weekly newspapers that are committed to local journalism to sustain themselves in the long run. One thing I'll say about the public policy question too is that the Local Journalism Sustainability Act is probably the best hope for some kind of financial. I wouldn't call it a lifeline because I don't think it's that sweeping, but some help for local news organizations. It was in the reconciliation bill before the bill was cut, and it does have some bipartisan support. But the fact that it was cut out in the latest round of negotiations suggests, as Jen indicated, is that it's not a high priority. I think our view is that local news is a public good, and it serves democracy, and it has a lot of benefits for those communities. And just as governments invest in vaccines and public health because it's good for the community, I don't think there's any reason that the government shouldn't invest in local news in that respect. It's obviously more controversial because you have questions about First Amendment, but most of the efforts are designed to provide tax credits for organizations that hire local journalists. And to me, my own personal view is that that's a worthy thing for government to consider.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of worthy things for government to consider, and they're not. So, I wouldn't put my eggs in that basket at this point. The one thing I would add about the weekly papers is that they're weekly, right? So, even if they're doing a good job, even if they're able in some communities to withstand these cuts, even if they're if they're able to make it, they're still providing information on a weekly basis, not on a daily basis. And they're not the place that people can go every single day to find out what's going on in their community. And what seemed relevant yesterday might not seem relevant 6 days ago. It's just a different model of consuming information and of being on top of what's going on in terms of local government and holding officials accountable. So it's not to say that there's not value provided there, and it's certainly better than nothing. And in many cases, they provide quite a bit of investigative, really important work, but it's just not the same thing as a daily paper.
And as much money as it takes to run a robust news operation, from the perspective of Google, Facebook, Twitter, like these are rounding errors. They could. Is there any prospect of them taking voluntary action from basically responding to your appeal for citizenship, in this case, corporate citizenship? Or should I not get my hopes up on that one?
Well, yeah, I think it's asking the question of whether we would expect social media companies to voluntarily engage in kind of mostly pro-social behavior, which is not to say that they can't do things that are good and haven't done things that are valuable, but that doesn't strike us as their orientation. And certainly the way in which they take local news from news organizations' original reporting and basically use it to boost their own traffic suggests that their economic incentives so far have taken precedence over the fortunes of these local news organizations. So I think my pessimism about this is similar probably to Jen's, and that's probably an unlikely route to success for local news.
There was a quote in there. Refresh me on who it is. It was somebody saying, I'm envious of these politicians in this era that can actually get away without being covered. I think even we as reporters sometimes tend to forget, because we'll be stiff-armed or have doors shut in the face and so forth. But we've got enormous ability to kind of hover over the public process because people are aware of, they're afraid of being watched. And in many communities, that's just not happening. They know that no one is watching. And so all the bad behaviors that people might be tempted to, there's really no obstacle to temptation, no reason to resist it if no one's paying attention. Refresh me on that. What's the quote I'm thinking of? There was somebody in there who said I think
you're thinking of the quote by David Simon, the creator of The Wire.
Yes, that's right.
The next couple of decades is going to be a great time to be a corrupt politician.
That's precisely right. It was David Simon. Of course, he, the great screenwriter, but got his start as a local news reporter in Baltimore, right?
Yeah, and I think, as you said, I mean, this is part of the motivation of the book is what are the consequences of the decline of these local news organizations? One of them, as we write in the conclusion of the book, is that not only does civic participation decline, which means probably fewer constraints on the actions of government, but also just fewer people watching what elected officials are doing. I mean, this is the chief benefit of having a free press and an independent news organization whose job it is to make sure that elected officials can't do things without us knowing. And when there are fewer watchdogs, then there's just going to be more bad behavior that happens. And although I think, it's hard to identify that now, there's not a lot of research that shows exactly what the effect of the closure of weekly newspapers or the decline of newspapers that we document, the effects that has on corruption or a lack of accountability. I feel pretty confident, and I think Jen would probably agree, that that's likely to happen in the coming years unless there's a real resurgence in local news organizations.
And I think it also applies to campaigns. I mean, a perfect test of this, I would be very, very interested to see the amount of local news coverage given to claims that critical race theory is taught in Virginia public schools. And my bet is that in the places where there are not robust local news sources and there was very, very little coverage, you're going to get people that were more inclined to believe that that was being taught and, who did say that education was a top issue for them in the governor's race. It's a testable hypothesis we can see, but I mean, it's not only lack of accountability toward elected officials, it's also a lack of being able to fact check and in a steady way, hold campaign promises and, claims, to the fire.
Yeah. Our hour's just about up, although we've certainly got a couple of minutes if anybody has a couple of more questions. I want to scroll through to make sure that...
if they don't, they should spend their time right now subscribing to their local newspaper. It'll take
there's one. I didn't
read it every morning.
After they buy our book.
Yeah.
After they buy our book.
Here is one. It's that I did miss earlier, and it's a good one. It's from Marianne Moxham, and she says that her local League of Women Voters in Williamsburg has resurrected the Observer Corps, and members are attending or watching virtually local elections, school board meetings, and reporting back to the league. And I do wonder whether the answer is in part more citizen journalism.
So the question is how it gets to the public, how it gets enough audience to really make an impact. And I think those efforts are great. And I think we think that there should be more of them. And the more direct citizen engagement, reporting on what's happening in local meetings is really valuable. But as the struggles that news organizations like Patch and other efforts to essentially deploy freelancers or unpaid or very poorly paid journalists to do this work has demonstrated that it's just very hard to generate a substantial amount of reporting. So I think it would be great if that works. And I think the engagement of citizens is really an important piece of the puzzle. But I think you still need professional news organizations with the resources to do the work that newspapers have traditionally done to really make democracy work at the local level.
Yeah, good. Well, we're just about out of time. You mentioned purchasing the book. I got mine on Amazon. I'm just looking at Amazon right now. It says only 13 copies left, but more, 13 copies in stock, but more on the way. So that's encouraging.
Click, people, they're running out.
Yes, if they've got more on the way, that means it's selling, and so they've ordered more from the publisher. That's a hardcover though, but Kindle, they've got unlimited. That's how I got mine, and it's $18.49. Money well spent. Danny Hayes and Jennifer L. Lawless. Newshole: The Demise of Local Journalism and Political Engagement. So anyway, just once again, congratulations to you both. I really think this is it's an important book, very well done, extremely, so much coverage on this is kind of anecdotal or impressionistic, and you really did a highly quantitative, supported look at the evidence on this, and it's really convincing. So just out of curiosity, how long did the book take you to do?
I think we began in 2014, right? Like in earnest in 20. We had been gathering data. We used data that we had started collecting in 2011 as well. But the data collection process, several years. The actual writing of it, several years.
Yeah, really important. Well, I hope the next edition or the sequel to this book is more upbeat, and it will highlight the number of success stories and flowers blooming from different experiments. But it's the field's pretty sparse at the moment.
That'll be the Netflix special.
Good. All right. Thanks both, and thanks to the Miller Center. Thanks to the audience for the great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Good afternoon.